This is Behavior-Driven Development Part 2. Some of you may have attended Part 1. It's not necessary to have attended Part 1, but this is the second in a series. I'm going to be covering some of the stuff that we'd covered before in Part 1, again, just so that we have some background information for those who didn't attend. So my name is Nick Kramer. I am the stream lead for Agile training for WebAge. I have been doing Agile coaching and training for about 10 years now. What makes me a little bit different than some other coaches and trainers is that I actually own a software development company. So I spend 50% of my time working as a product owner on a project that I'm working on, and I spend the other 50% of my time coaching and training. So everything that I'm going to teach you today or show you today is something that I use on a daily basis. So it's not just theoretical for me, it's actually something that I utilize every single day. Here is my email address. I am always available to answer any questions that you have, or if you'd like to Skype with me, either video Skype or chat in the Skype. I am online almost all day, every day. All right, a couple things here then. I'm going to open it up for questions right off the bat if you have any questions. But while we're doing that, a couple of housekeeping items. This is scheduled to go for 3 hours. I'm not sure if it really is going to go for 3 hours. Sometimes I get done sooner, sometimes I get later, but that's the first thing that I want to let you know. We will be taking a short break somewhere in the middle, or maybe even a couple breaks, depending on how time permits. That's the first thing. The second thing is I should tell you that I'm working from home today from my kitchen table, and I have a very opinionated cat. So if she comes and starts screaming at me, that's it. I'm not strangling her. You don't need to call the Humane Society or anything. It's just my cat trying to tell me that I'm probably in her space for the day. All right. I know some of you will be attending this webinar probably for the whole time period. Some may drop in, some may drop out, which is totally fine, and I'm okay with that. But I wanted to let you know that at the end of this webinar, I offer this free behavior-driven development quick guide that I have created. If you would like to get a copy of the guide, and here I'll show you what it looks like so that you can decide if it's something that you might be interested in. I'll share it with you. Just one moment. I can find it. While I'm hunting it down, if you would like to get a copy, please send an email there to Caroline, and she will make sure that you get a copy. Well, I don't know where it's at. I'll find it and show it to you. Isn't it here? It's right here. Don't you love technology? This stuff works really well when it wants to work. Oh, it's right here. It looks like this. It is a behavior-driven development guide, and it goes through kind of all the topics that we are going to cover today. The keywords for Gherkin syntax, how you'd build these things online, the roles and responsibilities. It's kind of a nice little book, if I do say so myself, and I'd encourage you to get it, even if you're not planning to do behavior-driven development. If you're doing Agile, this is something that would really help with your writing acceptance criteria, and we'll talk more about that. And let's flip back over to the. Okay, Cindy, go ahead. Questions.
I was just suggesting that if someone's not asking a question, maybe we mute our mics. I'm hearing a lot of background noise. I don't know if others are hearing it too.
Oh, great suggestion. So if you're not speaking, maybe mute yourself. Webinars are a little different. Let's see here. Okay. Thank you for the suggestion. All right, so that was the second piece of things that I wanted to cover. All right, there you go. The next thing I wanted to cover, in case you wanted to drop off early, is if you are interested in learning more about behavior-driven development or like to do some self-study, I highly recommend these two books. Of course, I'm always available to come to your organization to teach you how to do it, but if you want to learn on your own, these I think are the best two books, and these are the books that I give to my new staff members when they join. So this Cucumber book here is a good one, and then the Selenium WebDriver is also one. And I'm going to explain both of these tools in the latter half of this webinar. All right. So the first thing we want to talk about is why you would want to be agile and why you'd want to do behavior-driven development. So for a show of hands, how many people on the webinar here are actually doing some version of agile? Anybody? Oh, good. Quite a few. And this is why sometimes the webinar can go long or short. We don't need to necessarily cover topics that you guys are quite familiar with. So, wow, lots of people. All right. All right, so what I normally would like to do is I normally play this activity game. I think I'll play it anyway, even though I had one person that said that they had joined the first part of this webinar. So that's perfectly acceptable. I'm just going to play the game again, and you can get it. If you've done it before, just kind of play along here. This is a great game for any of you that are doing Agile and need to explain Agile to executives or sponsors, or if you're trying to show people, you know, what the difference is between Agile and Waterfall. So I encourage you to steal this game and use it. So the game works like this. It's called the Shapes game. I'm going to ask you to get a piece of paper out, and I'm going to read you these requirements here that are on the slide. Then I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to ask any clarifying questions about the requirements. Then once we have all the clarifying questions answered, I'll give you some time to actually draw the picture that I'm trying to get you to draw here. But my one request would be just don't start drawing until I actually say to start drawing. It kind of breaks the rhythm of the game a little bit. So here is how it goes. You want to get out a piece of paper, and you're going to want to fold that paper in half. Requirement number 2 then is in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to draw a circle. In the middle of the page, you're going to draw a triangle. Then you're going to draw an upside-down trapezoid below the triangle. Next one, you're going to draw a line connecting the triangle and the trapezoid. Next, draw a chevron across the bottom of the page. And then the last written requirement is draw a straight line below the chevron. All right, so now I'd like to open it up for any additional clarifying questions that you might have about the project we're trying to build here. Go ahead. Either type them in the chat, or everybody's microphone, I turned you on to allow you to talk. So go ahead. No clarifying requirement questions? Okay, so somebody asked, what are the size of the shapes? Great question. So I will give you some size of the shapes here, and you can write them down. The circle is a 1-inch diameter circle. The triangle is a 1-inch triangle. The trapezoid is 2 inches at the top, 1.5 inches on the bottom, and the chevron are vertically up and down 1/2 inch. Good question. Any additional questions about the picture? Everybody thinks we know what we need to draw? Well, we never had it before. We had one person ask one single question. Okay. So this is the shape that I was trying to get you to draw. How many people drew this picture or something similar, very close to this? Amanda raised her hand. Go ahead, Amanda. I think you might be on mute though. So I'm curious, how many people got a picture that looks similar to this? I have one person that says not even close. I have one person that says totally different. All right. So what we're trying to illustrate here is the difference between how we gather requirements in a waterfall fashion, how we gather them in an agile fashion, and how we gather acceptance criteria while we're doing that. So the game here that I'm trying to illustrates how we gather requirements in a more traditional waterfall project, right? I give you the requirements. You may get a chance to ask some clarifying questions. Then you go back to your desk or whatever, to your project team, and you actually build the software, you finish the project, and then you show it to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders say whether they like it or not. So in this particular example, how did we do? What could we have done different to make this project run a little bit smoother? We could have asked more questions while drawing, of course. We could, somebody says show mock-ups of what you wanted to develop. True. Additional thoughts, what we could have done different. Ask more questions, show progress along the way. Every time you draw a shape. So what you're saying is maybe be more iterative, right? Draw a little bit of something, say, does this what you want? And then go back and either correct what was wrong or adjust it and move on to the next shape. Yes, we could have done things more iteratively. And this is when done correctly, this exercise illustrates, right, that we have a tendency to take the requirements at face value. We assume that our stakeholders know exactly what they want and that they were able to document it correctly. And we just go and draw the picture or do the project. We rarely ask a lot of detailed clarifying questions. And the reason why we need to get in the habit of coordinating and working closely or more closely with our stakeholders is that, believe it or not, the stakeholders don't always know what they want, right? They think they do, and they write it down on paper, and it makes sense on paper. But as they see it being developed, they either change their mind, they realize the possibilities of what can really be done. The requirements shift because of the market around them. Priorities may be changing, right? So there's all these different reasons why we need to work more closely with our stakeholders and to bite things off in smaller increments rather than giant projects as a whole. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this famous slide cartoon, right, about how we gather requirements and how different people perceive different requirements. So what we're trying to do is to make the requirements gathering process a little bit simpler, a little bit more dynamic, and a little bit more flexible. And the key component of that a lot of organizations have a tendency to skip is the acceptance criteria. And so that's particularly where we are going to spend a lot of our time today, is talking about acceptance criteria. I wanted to cover the SCRUM cheat sheet here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the way SCRUM works. It's an agile framework that advocates that we build things in small increments over certain amounts of time boxes. A time box in SCRUM can be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. A lot of organizations generally do 2 to 3 weeks. So the way SCRUM works is we have a list of backlog items that we see on the page here. As we get ready as a team to start working on certain items, we do a sprint planning session and we decide what we're going to work on in that sprint or increment. And then we build ourselves a sprint backlog, a committed list of items that we are going to be completing. Then we get to work and start working on it. And then every single day we get together and discuss our progress. And at the end of the 2-week period, then we meet with our stakeholders and people that have would like to evaluate the software, and we show them what we completed in that sprint. Then they can provide their feedback. And then just like the stakeholders can provide feedback, we get the team together and we have a retrospective to decide how we can improve the process. Again, I'm sure lots of you are involved with this already. This cheat sheet is part of the Behavior-Driven Development Quick Guide if you'd like to get that. Now in SCRUM, there are basically 3 types of roles. There's the SCRUM Master. There are the Master of Ceremony that keeps the team humming along. There's the Product Owner that defines priority, helps write business stories, user stories, defines acceptance criteria, and all of that great stuff. And then lastly, there is the development team. Anybody that actively works on building the project is part of the development team. So it's very simple, just 3 small roles in SCRUM. And I'm going to talk more about how these roles, along with some of your more traditional roles, such as business analysts and that kind of thing, work together to define user stories throughout this webinar. All right, so we're going to do a quick overview of what behavior-driven development is. So quite simply, behavior-driven development is a way of describing what a customer will be doing with the requirement. So we provide thorough examples, real-life examples of how a customer will be interacting with our software, let's say. Let's say we're building software projects. This can be used on any sort of projects, marketing, human resources, all of those different things. It's a way of thinking things a little bit differently from an outside-in approach. And what I mean by that is traditional user stories, we think about things from a functionality standpoint, and then we decide how a customer will be using it. Behavior-driven development tries to flip that script a little bit and say, how will our customers be interacting with our software, and how can we build it better, or how can we build requirements and acceptance criteria around their actual usability of it. So we're actually putting the customer first. So it allows us to bring in multiple perspectives when writing stories, from the customer and the product owner, as well as it allows the team members to provide enough information so that they can get just enough information about how our customer is going to be implementing the behavior so that they can begin to work on developing it. All right, so behavior-driven development, of course, is BDD. Here's the acronym. I wanted to give it to you. Of course, this presentation will be available to re-listen to again, and there'll be a PDF version of the slides available on the website at webagesolutions.com. So if you'd like to use these slides, for another thing, please go ahead and do that. Behavior-driven development is essentially an approach of building shared understanding about how the software is going to be used. Rather than describing the functionality, we're actually going to be discussing behaviors, which is a slight, subtle shift, but it can make all the difference when we're writing stories. So when we're writing behavior-driven stories, we want to keep these key elements in mind. One, we want to make sure that we're always using a natural language. Behavior-driven development uses pure English language. We want to use a language that's ubiquitous across everybody that's going to be looking at the story. So if a developer looks at the story, they should understand exactly what it says. If a business person looks at a story, they should understand exactly what it says. There shouldn't be any technical jargon that nobody understands. There shouldn't be business jargon that nobody understands. Now, if that knowledge is necessary to understand the domain, as in say you're working in a health insurance company and you're using health insurance terms, that's okay. But we want to make sure that everybody in the organization understands what those domain-specific language is, so that over time, the user stories become ubiquitous, that everybody understands exactly what we're doing. It's a way of creating a shared process and shared tools to document user stories, and it also becomes the springboard for automation. I am going to show you how to automate behavior-driven development tests in the latter part of this workshop. Just one second, I'm gonna do this. If my computer will behave itself, it has a tendency to be weird today. I'm gonna do this. Just one second, I'm gonna put a few people on mute and allow some people to talk. That way everybody can participate. There we go, all right. So behavior-driven development generally comes in two parts. It comes in, the first part is about writing acceptance criteria in user stories in the form of examples of how the customer will be actually interacting with the software. And then the second part is taking those examples and being able to write tests, both manual tests, but primarily automated tests, in order to make the process smoother and more scalable over a long period of time. All right. Now, when we do this, we're all familiar with the normal story writing format, but we are going to need to flip the script on the story format just a wee bit in order to make it more accessible and reusable for behavior-driven development, especially if you're going to automate it. Now, I put in here that these slides about outside-in development on what that means. We want to make sure that we're always focusing on the customer, right? And who the end user is going to be. Behavior-driven stories are always written from the user's perspective, okay? Again, we're reviewing here. It should be written in a natural language that's domain specific, that we all understand. It also then creates a way of creating communication across all groups of people. It's a way of creating a conversation, just like all user stories are. Again, so it's about helping the developer team understand how someone is actually going to be using the software, and then they can build it correctly to make sure that it actually achieves the results that you want. Behavior-driven development also creates a shared capital. It creates a shared language that we can all use. It also creates a traceability and tracking and reusability of acceptance tests, about behavior-driven tests that we can be using over and over and over. Whereas sometimes with user stories, they become a little bit difficult to go back through and reuse because we write them as a point in time. Behavior-driven development and the acceptance tests that go with them become modularized, and you can say, I want to create this functionality, but I want to rerun the tests from this point forward or from all these other stories. So it creates essentially a test bank of behavior tests that we can use over and over and over. And like we talked about before, it's generally written in a normal English language that everybody can understand. It's very, it's not necessarily, it's not abstract. We want it to be understandable. Okay. Now that all being said, normal user stories that we write use this format as a I want so that, right? We'd say as a user, I would like to be able to do this one thing so that, and then you provide the reason that they're going to want, that we think as a customer or as a product owner that they're going to want to use this functionality. And there's lots of debate in the industry about, which of these is more important, which one is not, but we're not going to have that conversation today. We're going to talk then about how you flip it a little bit when you're writing behavior-driven development stories. And the way we do that is we change the order a little. We'll say, in order to achieve some results, the user is going to want to do something. So we're actually saying what the customer's end result is, what the thing is they're trying to do, what the value is they're trying to receive up front. And then we say what they want, because we want to focus on the value of the behavior that they're going to initiate. Then we can build the functionality around the behavior. Now there's a whole school of thought about when you're trying to determine what behaviors people are going to want to engage in, and there are whole methodologies that you can use to help identify what those are, such things as design thinking and agile UX and lean startup. These kinds of things help you understand what a true customer's behavior is. So for an example, I have a friend of mine who is trying to reinvent the gym bag. He thinks that the current gym bag is not adequate. Whether he's right or wrong, I'm not sure. But what he has done is he has started to watch athletes and people that go to the gym and watch how they actually interact with their current bag. And so he's trying to determine what the priorities are, or what is the value that each customer is trying to get from a bag. And he's using this knowledge to recreate functionality in a new bag. So it's a very, it's a way of experimenting with your customers and to find out what they want and how they're going to use it. So oftentimes as consumers, we get forced into using things the way they've been presented to us. And in the last few years, organizations that are able to rethink things and provide more value to customers and to provide things in a way customers want are becoming very disruptive to the industry, and they're making all kinds of change. An example is the cable, the cable market, the cable TV. Now people are starting to pay attention to how people actually use cable, where they get value, how they want to watch it, where they want to watch it, and those kinds of things. And it's becoming very disruptive. For example, Disney Plus just released, and Apple Plus, and Apple TV, and Roku, and all of these things. All the different channels are trying to pay attention to how a customer wants to use it, rather than how they think a customer should use it. And it's really causing quite a bit of disruption in many industries. Now, to illustrate this point, I put on your screen here a website called ATM Simulator. I know this is kind of interesting, but we need to type this into a web browser. And I'll leave this on the screen for just a moment, and then I will open up my web browser and I'll show you. It's an ATM simulation software. So take a moment and open up a web browser and type it in. And I know that's a long URL. Oops. So once it's open, you should see something that looks like this, and it's an ATM simulation. So if you say here, skip to the simulation, it actually opens up a simulation.
Select the card to insert it into the ATM.
Sorry, gotta let that guy talk. It is a simulation of an ATM machine. All right, so the first thing I'd like to talk about is, what are some different user stories that you would write about how a customer is going to access an ATM machine? And we don't have to be overly complicated with it. I'm just curious, what are some of the different functionalities that are available on an ATM machine? Anyone? Oh, I'm not even sharing the screen. Sorry. New share this. Okay, somebody says you're going to want to withdraw money. Sure. Deposit. Transfer. You're going to want to check a balance. Very good. And I think we've probably all used an ATM machine many times, so we know how we're going to use them, right? All right. Good. So we are going to be using this simulation throughout the course a little bit. But let's say this course is primarily focused on behavior-driven development, and we want to talk about how we're going to write acceptance criteria. Now, acceptance criteria has always been the linchpin for me in user story functionality. I've been teaching this a long time, and I've always personally have struggled on how to write acceptance criteria up until the time that I discovered behavior-driven development. So this has become opened up so many avenues for me on how to write correct acceptance criteria. So I'm hoping this will shed a light on some stuff for you. So if I had a story, that I'm gonna write this in the chat, that was something like, as a bank checking account customer, I would like to be able to withdraw cash so that I can pay the babysitter. Ugh, can't type. Okay. So what are some of the normal acceptance criteria that you would have if you had a story similar to this? Go ahead and type them in the chat. What would you normally see for acceptance criteria? The story is in the chat. You should be able to see it's from me. I sent it to all the participants. So that's a good one, Amanda. And a numeric key will be available for entry of memos. That's good. Cannot see responses from other people. Interesting. I'll read them out as you get them. How come I can't? I know there's a way to do that. You can't see the text that I wrote. So the story is, as a bank checking account customer, I would like to be able to withdraw cash so that I can pay the babysitter. The first one we have is you need a numeric keyboard. The next one would be all right, let's see if this helps. Can you see that now? There we go. All right. Sorry about that. So if you saw this story, let's talk about this one more time. What would be some acceptance criteria that your product owners would be providing to you in order to complete this story? The system must receive input from customers and on amount to withdraw. Okay. A slot must be provided to enter the user's credit card. Okay. The system should verify balance. Perfect. So all of these are, the system would verify balance of the account. If the balance is lower than the requested amount, provide an error. Yes. Okay, so now I think it's a good time to talk about the difference between an acceptance criteria and an acceptance test. The first one, an acceptance test, is probably what you're providing here. They're actually system things that are going to happen inside the system. It's actually logic that you're going to put into to a user story. Acceptance criteria is a little bit different. It's defining how we know when we've been successful in completing a story from a user's perspective. At least that's how I define them. User acceptance tests are more business rules. Acceptance criteria are behavior-driven rules. All right, so I'm gonna flip back to the slide. We're gonna come back to this ATM machine again, so keep it handy if you don't mind. And I'll bring back up the webinar here. The other one that we are going to use occasionally throughout this class is called WebDriver University. And so I'm going to show you that. You probably won't have to go to that one, but I am going to be using it for some other activities. So when writing behavior-driven development stories, the question I always get is, who should be involved in writing those? And the answer is, it's the same people that would be involved in writing normal stories. And there's a lot of confusion, even with normal Agile, about how often should you be touching a user story to get it complete, right? Do you touch it once and then hand it off to the team? Should you be redefining it always, right? And the answer is, a user story should be touched many, many, many times before a team gets it. You don't just write a one-sentence thing and a couple acceptance criteria and move on. So this chart here should indicate kind of on the pipeline of software development, from release planning to your daily scrum, how often you are touching stories and who should touch them. So when you're doing release planning or backlog planning, you want your developers, your testers, and your product owners, and your analysts maybe even, to be actively working on stories and acceptance criteria. As you get closer to, and those are the primary roles, as you get closer to sprint planning, the testers and the developers should be heavily involved now. They should be looking closer and closer at the stories and getting more and more clarification. And then as we do daily stand-ups, of course, and daily scrumming, the testers and developers are writing code and testing. And then at the very end, during the retrospectives and the demonstrations, we show it back to the product owner. So all three of these roles should be heavily involved with user story refinement and writing throughout the entire process. In behavior-driven development, we think about 4 specific roles: the product owner, who's responsible for maximizing the value of the product; the Scrum Master, who leads the team; the developer, who writes the code; and the tester, who tests the code. When you put the product owner, tester, and developer together, we call this the 3 amigos. And this little chart that I have here should describe kind of who's involved at what point. So the product owner initially writes the story, and then the tester and the developer add some tests, right? That's what the Gherkin tests are. The developer then designs around those. The tester automates those tests, and then we build the code, and then finally the tester verifies it, and then we pass it back to the product owner for final validation. These 3 roles are key when working with behavior-driven development, because we want to make sure that we always have all 3 perspectives: the product owner's perspective, which is from the customer; the tester on how we're going to test these stories; and the developer on how we are going to build them. Another way to think about this is developers write code to solve acceptance tests. Testers write code to solve acceptance criteria, or for test for acceptance criteria. The goal here is to make sure that we're sharing experiences across all 3 of these roles so that we're getting a wide set of experiences, okay? There's a lot of verboseness in this slide deck here. It's mostly so that if you want to see it and want to remember what I said, you can come back to the slide deck. All of these slides are in the quick handout book too. So if you'd like to refer back to this, please just send an email off to us and we'll send you the quick book. All right. The product owner and the tester work very closely together to write the stories, right? We're going to talk about Gherkin here in a moment, but what Gherkin is it's the language, the technical language that we use to write acceptance criteria so that they can be automated. The developers and the testers then work together to define the acceptance criteria and acceptance tests so that the developer knows how they're going to be tested so that they write just enough code to pass the test. We're trying to get the developers to write solid, substantial code that provides the simplest amount of value at an increment at a time. We don't want the developers to gold plate stories. We want to do just enough to pass the test. So if we have more functionality to build in the future, we can add that functionality and then we can build upon it by reusing those modular tests like we talked about before. The way the process generally works here is we define business rules and stories, right? Then we create formalized code. Then we automate the tests. We deliver that into production, and then we discover new code and new functionality as we go. So this cycle here kind of goes on. And by automating these tests and making them reusable, we can always make sure that our entire platform is working the way it should and that we're not breaking things as we go. All right, so I've made reference several times to the Gherkin syntax. And the Gherkin syntax is the way that we write behavior-driven acceptance criteria in behavior-driven development. This language is very simple to use. It's very natural, like we talked about before. And so this is what, if you're planning to automate tests, you're going to want to use this language, and I'll show you why shortly. So what we are looking for is there are three major keywords in the Gherkin syntax. The first one is given, the second one is when, and the third one is then. And a lot of business analysts, if you've written requirements before, have probably seen something similar before. And that's why we are using these keywords, is because business analysts in the past have used this to write waterfall requirements. So the given tells us where we're starting, the when tells us the action, and the then tells us what we expect to get. Oops. Oh, that's a duplicate slide. So here are all of the Gherkin keywords. So if you're saying to yourself, boy, this learning a new language has got to be complicated, it's got to be super technical, the answer is no, because this is probably the most keywords that most user stories will use. I would say 95% of the user stories that I have written and used Gherkin syntax to write the acceptance criteria, 95% of them use one of these keywords. One or actually use more, but there are a few other ones outside of here, but I have rarely used them, right? And so you can see there's given, when, and then. There's some others there that we're going to talk about. But this is the extent of this part of the technical language. All right, one of the keywords that you're going to use when you're writing a Gherkin acceptance criteria, or sometimes it's referred to as a Gherkin file, and a Gherkin file is a way of grouping together acceptance criteria. And we call it a file because when we drop it into the automation tool, it becomes a file. So we just get used to calling it a file here. But the feature is a keyword that describes in English what we are going to be doing with this particular user story and what we will be testing. And you can see there's the word feature with colon, and then everything after that is just plain English. You can write whatever you want. So in our story before, where you had the ATM example, I would probably just put the user story here, or what we're trying to accomplish. Okay. Underneath the keyword feature, we then have a scenario. And a scenario is a behavior on which we will be testing from a user perspective. So you'll see here, we're going back to that ATM example that we'd used before. And we named the scenarios. The first line here just kind of gives us a quick description of what we will be testing. So in this particular test, we're going to be testing to see if we have a successful withdrawal from an account. Right? Now you'll see here is that first Gherkin keyword called given. So remember, this is a real life example. So you're going to say, given I have $100 in my account, when I request 20, then $20 should be dispensed. You can see here, the given tells us where we're starting the scenario. The when tells us what we're going to be doing. And the then tells us what we expect the outcome to be. So another way of putting that is, there is context, there's an event, and there is an outcome. You can see I took the story that you had before there, and I have put the context, the event, and the outcome there. All right, just 1 second, please. We'll grab something. Sorry about that. So you can see here that I've added the given, the context, the event, and the outcome here. Sorry, I had a sneezing fit. I didn't want to do it on. All right, we will practice this here in just a moment, so this should become clear, right? And I've described here then what the given statement is in great detail. It describes the initial condition or the place where we will be starting the test. One of the things that a lot of people get hung up when they're writing behavior-driven tests is they get hung up with that you have to rewrite all the steps to get to where you were to doing a test. So if you're only interested in checking the balance on your credit card, you don't have to necessarily, for each test, you don't have to start with entering the card into the machine and putting the PIN number in. You could say, this is the starting line that I'm going to be starting from. So that is where you're starting the test. We can make some assumptions that we have pre-built tests up to that point that other tests have already covered, but the given tells us what's the starting point where we want the developers to start the test. So somebody asked a question, how detailed do you go with the given statement? For example, the person has an account at the bank, their account is in good standing, etc., or we assume all this? That's a great question, and I hope I answered that. It depends on where you draw the line in the given. You make the assumption that everything before the given passed, and then we're just starting a new test from the new starting point, right? When you start running these in an automated fashion, you might say run 5 tests up to this point and then run this new one. So we start stringing tests together, but the given tells us where we start and whatever preconditions have been made. The when tells us then, what are we exactly doing? What are the steps that we are going through? What are the behaviors that I am enacting to try and perform something, right? What is the actor actually doing? So this is actually, I want to make this clear to start with, that these are always real life examples, right? On those examples I gave a minute ago, we actually talked about real balances and real amounts. So got to make sure we're always using real examples. Okay, and then finally, the then tells us what we expect the outcome to be. And the outcome, of course, can be true, it can be false. You can say something is going to be equal to something else or not equal to something else, or I expect to be moved over to this screen. So it's an actual outcome that you would know on whether something passed or didn't pass. So if you are writing user stories from, well, let's go on a couple, and there's some. An assertion in behavior-driven development is a simple way of saying, how are we going to check? So if we do an assertion, we say, we are going to check that we ended up on the validation screen. We are going to check that this happened. That's how we know that the then statement worked or didn't work, by those word assertion. All right. The final keyword I want to talk about real quick is the and statement. If you have, it is possible in a acceptance criteria to have multiple givens, multiple whens, and multiple thens. And as you can see in this story here, you don't have to repeat the words over and over. So like, for example, the scenario here is I'm attempting to withdraw using a stolen card. And there's the given, I have $100 in my account, but my card is invalid. So you could say, you could say, given I have $100 in my account, given my card is invalid, when I request $50, then my card should not be returned, then I should be told to contact the bank. So rather than saying the whens, the multiple givens, whens, and thens, you can use the word and or but in their place. So it's just a way of making it more ubiquitous, like we talked about, because it's more natural language. And so when you drop it into the automation tool, it will then just substitute those words for you. It's smart enough to know that if the but here is just another given. All right, so you'll notice here, the first little quiz I want to give you is this a real life example? What is missing from this to make it a real life example? Am I not sharing? I should be. Oh, I'm sharing. Sorry, good question though. Yeah, it's pretty close. The only example here that's missing to make this a real example is that you would say something like, given I have $100 in my account and I enter a PIN number of 456, but my card is invalid, because you actually have to give the example of the PIN number to make it real life. We're actually missing a real life example here, right? We're not, you're not going to allow, you have to have an actual PIN number to test again to validate whether it's invalid. So these are, when you're writing acceptance criteria, you want to use real examples with real data. And I'm going to show you when we put it over in the automated tool here in just a moment on how we can do this. But make sure that you're always using real examples with real data. Along with, there are other ways, other keywords. There's like a pound symbol here that is used for comments. So if you want to add comments to it, or you want to comment out certain lines, those of you that are developers or have development experience, you understand the value of a comment separator. So there's a pound sign in BDD is a comment, which means we ignore anything after the comment that it's really not part of the example, or it's just informational only. All right. Questions about the Gherkin syntax so far? All right, before we move any further, I want to talk just a little bit about what test-driven development is. So test-driven development is a practice that developers have used for a long time, on which they do something called red-green testing. And I'm going to skip to the second slide here because it better illustrates. And what red-green testing is A developer gets a story before step number 1 here, or they get a requirement, or they're about to start writing some code. Developers then write the tests first to validate whether their code works, even though they have not written any code at all. So that's step 1 here. They first write test. Then they run the test. And since there's no code to run, they know that the test is going to fail. That's in red status. Then the third step is they actually write the code. Then they rerun the tests that they wrote before, and now the test should pass. If the tests don't pass, they go back to the drawing board and they write code to make them work. Then they rerun the test to validate. So they're constantly circulating between red and green testing. Now, the advantage of test-driven development is that the developers are only writing just enough code to pass the test. That's all they're concerned about. It's like giving someone the exam answers and then telling them to take the test, right? They're not going to write some extra essay for fun. They're only going to answer the questions that are on the test. And that's exactly what developers are striving to do, generally. Now, what makes this so powerful for 2 reasons is, 1, we've only written just enough code. And number 2, these tests then are used over and over, they become reusable. So if a developer refactors the code, and what we taught when we're talking about refactoring, we mean if the developer changes part of the code to make it more efficient, or they make any changes to the code at all for enhancement purposes, they can rerun their old test again to make sure that they still pass. That way, they're having, just like in behavior-driven development, this way they have a constant set of tests that they can run to validate that their code is in good shape, that they haven't broken anything. These are generally what acceptance tests are for developers. So when we write acceptance tests, they will use those to create their tests. Behavior-driven development uses the same concepts, but we're going to do red-green testing against customer behavior. Okay, so this has been a common practice for developers for years. All good developers and all really good development shops perform test-driven development on acceptance tests. So what behavior-driven development is doing is we are taking that same concept and we are applying it to customer behavior or to user behavior. Okay, so in order to do that, of course, we have to do all those things that we talked about before and start reframing our tests, our acceptance criteria on how a customer is going to use our system. Now, we want to make sure that we're always focusing on the 80-20 rule, and we want to build tests around 80% of the functionality. You could do 100%, but of course that gets very complicated, and you start moving into edge cases that can be very difficult to test for. So you want to make sure that we're testing for the bulk of the functionality that the major users are going to use. Now, I recently saw a video about the difference between TDD and BDD and how they work together. The great example was if I am driving a car and the car doesn't start, there are certain behaviors that I'm going to go through first to check to see if the car doesn't start. So from a behavior standpoint, I'm going to do things like, well, check to make sure that the key's in the ignition. Check to make sure that there's gas in it. Check that make sure when I turn the key, you know, it turns over. These are behaviors that an actual user is going to use. The test-driven developments that if you were coding to create a car would be things like validate that the spark is working, validate that the spark is entering the chamber. So they become at 2 different detail levels. One is based on actual functionality of the system, and the other is examples of how the user would test it. Now, from a user perspective, That's all they care about, is that they can get the behaviors to do what they want. So for ultimate customer satisfaction, you want to make sure that your behavior-driven development tests are always passing. All right, now let's get into the heart of Cucumber. And I'm going to warn you right now that I've been practicing, or not practicing, I have an environment that I'm going to switch over to and show you how to do behavior-driven development, but it has been a little buggy for me today because Chrome keeps wanting to update itself, and my whole system is built on an old version of Chrome. So I'm going to jump over there and show you what the environment looks like. Maybe. Oh, where is it? Just 1 second. It's here. Where'd it go? All right, you should be able to see this screen now. It's a window screen and with some files on the left and some code on the right. Can you see that? I hope so. Okay. This is the environment in which we automate tests using behavior-driven development. Every test boils down to just 2 files. The first file is what we call a feature file. You can see here I've created a login feature file. Here, I'm going to open it up. Oh, come on. No. Behave yourself. There you go. So this should look semi-familiar, right? Here's the feature that we talked about. And the feature that I'm going to be testing is being able to log into an account. And I put a note here that says existing users should be able to log into the account using corrected credentials. So you'll notice here that the scenario that I'm testing for is we're going to log into the account with the correct credentials. Now here are the tests I'm going to run. See, here's the given keyword. The given, the user navigates to this website, Stack Overflow, real example, and the user clicks on the log on button. So I'm actually saying what the behavior is going to be. When the user enters a valid username and the user enters a valid password and the user clicks on the log on button, then this is the behavior. The user should be taken to the successful login page. Now, if you are a business analyst and you are looking to write behavior-driven development and you are concerned that this is too complicated to understand, this is the entire behavior-driven development from an analytical standpoint, from how you would write it as an analyst or product owner. So if you can write and follow these simple format rules here, you should be good to go. Of course, this isn't going to do any testing, but then you'd hand this off to a tester, or an analyst can easily learn how to write the next step. And I'm going to show you about that. So the next step would be every feature file then has what's called a login step, or a steps file that goes with it. And this step file here is the one that goes with this code. And you can see here that to make it simple, we're going to ignore this. There's this given statement here. See this @given? That should correspond to the given statement that's here. So it's saying, look at this first given. And then it says, we're looking for the given that has this name in it. User navigates to Stack Overflow website. So click up here and you can see that should be the exact name. So what we're saying is take your acceptance criteria that's here, go to your steps file, and run the code that's here. Now, the only part that makes this a little tricky is understanding the code that you write here. And this is written in a language called Selenium, which is also very simple to understand. You can Google almost anything you want and say, how do I open up a website in Selenium? And you'll get this piece of code here and you drop it in. It's super simple. I am not a developer by trade, and I have taught myself how to do this, or you just go to Google, like I said, and figure it out. So this is going to say that when you run it, open up this URL. Pretty simple. When you get to here, it says there's a second given with this code. User clicks on the log on button. So if we go back to the feature file, user clicks on log on button on homepage. Same. What it's going to do is run a driver. This is the Selenium code that says find an element on the screen called login, and then click on it. There's a lot of hoverovers on this screen. Sorry, I'm trying to stay away from them. The next step is when a user enters a valid username. Let's validate if that's the same. Yes. Then it's going to run this code. It's going to find an element on the screen called email, and it's going to use the keys, this send key thing, to actually pass in a password or a username. All right, then it's looking for the next one is valid password. It's going to find an element called password on the screen, and it's going to pass in the password. Then it's going to look for the login button on the screen, and it's going to click on it. So it's going to look here for something called submit button, and they're going to click it. And then finally, this then statement here is what we call the assertion. So it is going to wait. This means it's going to wait 3 seconds, and then it's going to verify right here, this code, that there is something on the screen called Ask Questions button, and that it is displayed. So if that button is displayed on the screen, then we know that the test is passed successfully. All right. Really, and it doesn't get a whole lot more complicated than this. So if I run this test, let's cross our fingers that this works well, and I say run the configuration, and I say run, it should open up a web browser and run my test. It's opening a web browser. It's going to Stack Overflow. It put it all in. It looked for ask questions. Now, if I go back here on my console in the bottom, it ran one scenario, it ran 6 steps, and all 6 tests passed. So you can see here that I've automated that test. Now, every single time that I'm testing that particular website, I can just run that same test over and over and over, and we start to build them on top of each other. Now, the one example I wanted to make here is let's just assume that we're going to do a negative case here, and I want to look for, oops, sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's say our test would be that we do not want to find that button, Ask Questions button here. So if it doesn't fall, this means if it doesn't pass, the test would actually pass if it doesn't find Ask Questions. So let's run this now and see what happens. So we run it. If it behaves itself, the browser should open. You'll see here how it moves really quick. It's clicking, it's doing. Okay, now it gets to the screen. We go back to the test. And this one should now have one step that failed because the Ask Questions button did come up. All right. So this is a very simple example of behavior-driven development. You take your cases, your acceptance criteria, you plug them into login features. This is something into feature files, I mean, this is something that analysts, product owners can definitely do. You can have multiple scenarios per page. I'm going to show you some examples of how you can run multiple cases to make things simpler. But they drop it in here. Then the tester or the product owner who's ever trained, but it's pretty simple, goes through and they write this code here. Now, I didn't do this for this example, but I should have showed you, well, I can do it. Let's get rid of this file here to show you. All right, so now I only have the feature file. There is no step file. Okay, once the product owner puts this in, I know that screen before looked like a lot of code. But if I do this and I run the file the first time, this would be my red test, right? I've written all of my code, written all of my tests, and I'm going to run it without any functionality. If I run it now, it should fail because there's nothing for it to pass against, correct? No code. All right, if you slide up here, it will say that it ran the scenario and the 6 steps are undefined. Now you'll notice all of this code here. See these given and ats and whens and thens that are down here in the at symbols? This code here, I just cut, copy, and paste into a steps file. And then all I have to do is write that Selenium code that goes with it. So, but I see the comment, just one moment. The Cucumber tool actually starts to write the bulk of the steps file for you, so that all you have to do now is write the Selenium code to check for the elements on the page. Oops, let's see. Let me see the chat. Someone says all of these save functions can be saved as common functions that use the same given or when, for example, for other tests, right? Yes, so for sure. And there's a couple different ways that you can do this. You could write your test cases that say, your acceptance criteria say always, run the login feature and run all these other features simultaneously. Or since this code here has a name, right, this step, given users navigate to Stack Overflow, you only have to write it in the step file once, and every single time that it sees this particular code name, it will always run this step again. So you might have this given step in multiple scenarios, but it's you only have to write the code once down here because it'll always see the same one over and over. Great question. All right, so let's do another example. This works pretty good for simple examples, but if you want it to be a little more complex, you can definitely do that. So the next example I'm going to give us is, I'm going to delete this example so they don't interfere with each other, because I'm going to try that other website now. All right, so this is my feature file. I'm just going to drag it up here since I already wrote it. I don't want to. All right, and I'll show you. So I click on this and open it up. Here is my login feature. Now this one is a little bit differently because this one is going to go against a different website. And here's my feature. I'm going to log into this website, university.com. Now a background is a way of saying I'm going to share this given when statement across both of these scenarios. So every time you run this scenario, you run this given when. Every time you run this scenario, you go back up and run this given when first. So this one is actually going to run through a scenario twice. Once for this password and once for this password. Okay. Now, since there's no step file down here, if I run this, it should fail. it failed. If you slide back up a little bit, you can see that it failed. Yep. So it ran a little more. It ran 2 scenarios with a total of 12 steps, but this undefined means that it can't find the step file. So each one of these steps is undefined. Now notice here, if the code is written for me here, given, when, then, the only thing, let's take for example the given. The only thing that's missing, it'll have this public void part. The only thing that's missing is the Selenium code that goes right here. So let's bring up the steps file. And open it. And like I said, I am not a developer and I've taught myself to do this over the last couple of years. So you'll see here the given statement is I access the website. All of this is the code that I just cut and pasted. And all I have to add is this Selenium piece here, right? If you look down here, oh, it's down here. If you look down here, it's exactly the same except for this line. So I actually cut all of this and paste it into this file. So this one says we're going to go to WebDriver University. We're going to click on the login portal button. It's going to find a button with that name. It's going to click on it. Then it's going to put in my username. It's going to put in my password. And then it's going to click succeed. Now, if you look at the feature here, it's going to run through twice. So this is a way of simplifying your code so that you can run 2 scenarios, different kind of scenarios with 2 different outcomes using sharing code here. So let's see what happens when I run this. Let's see if it'll behave itself. I got to save this file first. Oops. Sorry. Let's save it. Come on, save. You guys know how this goes. You spend days and days working on these examples and then you try to show them to somebody and they go, oh, sorry, this name is wrong. There. So we run this. It's like when you take your car in and you say it makes this rattling noise, and then they drive it down the street and it doesn't make that noise and you look stupid. So we run it. Oh, come on. Okay, so it should open up the thing. It's going to run it twice. So put in a username, password, and it succeeded. You saw that. And then it failed, which is exactly what we're looking for. So let's walk through, let's look at how that functionality should work one more time. I'm going to take this URL, paste it in here. So it goes to the website, web.university. It's going to click on the login portal button. Then it's going to put in a username and password and click on login. And if it's successful, you'll get a successful message, which was scenario 1. If you click on it, put it in wrong and you click on login, you'll get an unsuccessful message. So you'll see that if you go here and look at the second example, your validation failed and the validation succeeded. So if we go back to our code here and we look, we had 2 scenarios that we ran, and all 12 steps of those scenarios passed because it did exactly what the test expected it to. All right, any questions so far about behavior-driven development and how simple it can be or how you would use it? All right, we're moving right along. We're going to be done way early. I apologize. I expected there to be more questions. Usually we have a lot more questions. I have one more example I'd like to show you that shows the true power of how we can use it. So I'm going to delete this example and I'm going to bring up another example. If my computer will behave itself, I have to minimize all these windows. If I close one by accident, then we're going to be in big trouble. Okay, so the next example we're going to be is called contact data. So what contact data is back on that university WebDriver website. If you click on this Contact Us button, then you should put in a first name, a last name, an email address, and some comments, and then you hit submit. Now, there might be times where you want to run through hundreds and hundreds of different scenarios. Let's say you have a giant web form and you just have all kinds of different scenarios you want to test, right? Let's say you're doing an ATM machine and you want to test, a whole bunch of different kinds of PIN numbers or something like that. Rather than writing a test case for every single scenario, every single individual scenario, what we do is we start to string them together and we create what we call data tables. And data tables can become very powerful tools, and there are numbers of ways to use them. I am only going to show you this one way because it's only a webinar. But so, for example, here, this scenario is we're going to submit valid data to the Contact Us form. So given that I'm on that form means I've already signed on, and I enter a valid username, and a valid last name. And now it says, these are the values that we're going to enter: Woods, Jackson, Jones. Each one of these pipes says run a different scenario for each one. And I enter a valid email address, and I enter comments, and then these are the comments, and I click on submit, then we should get certain results. So let's run this. And what should happen when I run this? Anybody, before I run it, what's going to happen? Okay, it should fail because there's no code to go with it. It's still thinking for some reason. Let's try one more time. Okay, the scenario ran. It had 7 steps on it. None of them worked. All 7 are undefined. Here is the code that I would use to create a steps file. I would cut and paste this, then just drop the Selenium code in the same spot where it says pending exceptions. All right, and in order to, so we don't have to do all of that, I've already written that code. So we'll just drag that up here to the steps file. And we'll take a peek at it. Now you can see here's all that code. We're accessing the website. We're putting in a first name. Now, you'll see this one's a little bit different because, all right, it's passing in the names. So it should run it multiple times based on that file. Where did it go? It should run it for Woods, Jackson, and Jones. So this one should run 3 times, and these are the comments that go with those. So let's run this and see what happens. Okay, it's filling it out. Should fill it out. Tom Jackson. So what this is saying, if you look at this closely here, is we're going to say the first name is always Tom based on the steps file. Where did it go? Where did it go? The first name is always Tom. The last name, we are going to enter a valid last name. This means that we're going to accept the value that's inside of this, the steps, the feature file. So we're going to accept the value Woods, Jackson, and Jones. All right. And then it's going to run the same thing for the comments. Let's run this one more time. It happens really fast. We'll see if we can catch it doing it again. It should run it 3 times. Yep, it happened so fast that it tested all of those. They all passed. And I believe all of these ran through the scenario 3 times with these comments. So by creating these data tables, they're called data tables, you could pass through as many names as you wanted, right? And so if you had hundreds of different names that you needed to test through the system for something, or you had a form that you needed to fill out multiple fields for different people, like, you know, these addresses for this person and these phone numbers for that person, you can create these data tables that simulate data. Now, the great thing about this is I actually create these in Excel then. So I create a user story, write the acceptance criteria that looks like this. And then I create these here in Excel and say, these are the test data that I would like to run through the system. Now, the great thing about this is a lot of times, I don't know about systems that you work on, it becomes difficult sometimes to get the data into the system correctly. To seed data, you always have to get this test data just right. By using behavior-driven development, you don't have to necessarily have the data in the system, because you can use this to actually seed the data into the system, or to run the cases by inserting the data as you go. That way you don't have to always be resetting data. You just enter the data as you need to. So this is called a data table, and which allows you to create literally hundreds and thousands of cases at a time. All right. Oops. Questions so far? All right. Boy, not a lot of questions. I'm surprised. So in order to get started with using behavior-driven development, besides just kind of retooling how you write user stories and how you start thinking about how you're writing acceptance criteria using examples, you need to then have a couple different sets of tools. So you need to decide what kind of framework you want to use. Now, the other really great thing about behavior-driven development is you can buy these tools if you want, but every tool that I have showed you today was free. Cucumber, which is the feature files and the steps files, was free. I just downloaded it into my development environment from the internet, and away we go. Selenium, the code that's used to check for web elements and do the clicking and the insertion of data, is also free, right? And there are many versions of these frameworks depending on what your needs are and which kind of technology you use. For example, Cucumber works really well with .NET code and Java code. And it works well with Java code. There is another version of it that works well with .NET code. That being said, if you're developing in a Java environment, you don't have to necessarily use behavior-driven development that's Java-based. So there are several different considerations. If you have architects at your organization, they can help you determine what the best framework is. But the good news is the bulk of them are free. Okay. The other good news is you don't necessarily always have to have a tool to get started, right? You can start writing your user stories now, today, with acceptance criteria that are behavior driven. Get in the practice of thinking of value for the customer, using real life examples of how the customer is going to be using that piece of functionality. Think about how you're writing them, right? Start using a natural language, a domain specific language, all of that good stuff. And make sure that you're taking a value driven approach to acceptance criteria. So you don't necessarily have to have a tool to get started. And most organizations I work with start by just getting better at writing acceptance criteria, and then they move on to the frameworks to create the automated tools, tests. All right. Believe it or not, we just whipped right through that because you guys were such a great audience. And I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. Or questions. Do you have any questions? Do you have any comments? I'm sorry, I don't want to waste your time. I could go on and on, but the purpose of this webinar was to give you an overview on how easy it is to use the tools to automate your behavior-driven tests. And as I'm sure, I hope you see that they're pretty simple. Any questions, any comments?
Yeah, it was super helpful to see like the concrete examples for me. I've heard of some of these like practices at a high level, but it was like difficult for me to understand and practice how it would be used. So this was super helpful. I could see how we could use it on our team.
Good. And I should tell you that I'm using what's called a browser driver so that you can actually see the test running on the screen. But when you get implemented, you can actually put versions of the drivers in that you don't actually see it. So it's actually running in the background. You don't have like 10,000 Chrome windows open. It's just kind of running behind the screen. Those are called headless browsers. And that's what most organizations use. I just want to let you know that if you try to implement it, if you don't implement the right browser, it might be working, you just don't see it working. Any other questions? We're here for a while. I'm sorry this went so fast. I'm not sorry. I'm actually glad that you got what you needed. Please send Carolyn an email here if you'd like to get that guide. And then look for those slides to be printed on the website within the next day or so. All right, I will be putting the presentation up here in the next, by the end of the day. It should be up and you can go out there and get the deck. If you would like the copy of the book, send Carolyn an email. If you don't have any more questions, I appreciate your time and your participation, and I hope everybody has a great day and good luck testing.